which Quranic are against science?
The question of whether Quranic verses are against science is a complex and sensitive topic, as interpretations of both the Quran and scientific knowledge vary widely. Many scholars and believers argue that the Quran is compatible with science, pointing to verses that align with modern discoveries, e.g., embryology, cosmology. However, critics, often non-believers or skeptics, highlight certain verses they claim conflict with established scientific understanding. Below, I'll address some commonly cited examples raised by critics, provide the Quranic context, and explain why these are seen as contentious, while also noting defenses offered by scholars. I'll aim to be objective, concise, and respectful, focusing on the verses critics often mention, as per the search results and broader discourse. Commonly cited, Quranic verses alleged to be against science critics, such as those referenced in sources like Explore Islam, point to specific verses. They argue contradict established science, defined as empirical observations or conclusions unlikely to change. Below are key examples, their interpretations, and responses from defenders of the Quran. The sun setting in a muddy spring, Surah Al-Kahf, 1886, verse, "Until, when he Zulkarnain reached the setting point of the sun, he found it setting in a spring of muddy water, and he found a people near it." Quran, 1886. Critics claim. Critics argue this verse suggests the sun physically sets in a muddy spring, implying a flat Earth or geocentric model, which contradicts the heliocentric understanding that the sun is stationary relative to Earth's rotation. Defense. Scholars like those cited in Explore Islam explain this as a description of Zulkarnain's perspective, not a literal claim. The Arabic word wajada, found, implies how it appeared to him, akin to saying, the sun sets over the ocean when observing a sunset. Other verses, like 21:33, "And he is the one who created the day and the night, the sun and the moon, each floating in an orbit," suggest an orbital understanding, aligning with modern astronomy. The verse reflects human perception, not a scientific error. The sun and moon, swimming in orbits, Surah Al-Anbiya, 21:33, verse, "And he is the one who created the day and the night, the sun and the moon, each floating in an orbit." Quran, 21:33. Critics claim. Some critics argue this implies the sun orbits the Earth, supporting a geocentric model, which contradicts the heliocentric model where Earth orbits the sun. Defense. Islamic scholars note that the term falak, orbit, is broad and can refer to celestial motion generally. The verse doesn't specify that the sun orbits Earth. It could describe the sun's movement within the galaxy or relative to other stars, consistent with modern astronomy. The Quran's language is often poetic and not meant as a technical treatise. Critics may misinterpret the verse by imposing a geocentric assumption not explicit in the text. Meteorites made of copper, Surah Ar-Rahman, 55:35, verse, "There will be sent upon you a flame of fire and copper, so you will not be able to defend yourselves." Quran, 55:35. Critics claim. Critics interpret nuhas, translated as copper or molten metal, as suggesting meteorites are made of copper, which is scientifically inaccurate, as meteorites are primarily iron, nickel, and stone. Defense. Scholars argue nuhas is a metaphorical term for smoke, molten material, or a fiery substance, not literal copper. The verse addresses jinn and humans in a context of divine punishment, not a scientific description of meteorites. The Quran often uses vivid imagery to convey spiritual messages, not chemical compositions. This interpretation avoids conflict with science. The sky as a ceiling, Surah Al-Anbiya 21:32, verse, "And we made the sky a protected ceiling, but they turn away from its signs." Quran, 21:32. Critics claim. Critics argue this depicts the sky as a solid structure, like a dome or ceiling, which conflicts with the modern understanding of the atmosphere as a gaseous layer. Defense. Islamic scholars interpret ceiling, SAQF, as metaphorical, describing the sky's protective role, like shielding Earth from harmful radiation or meteoroids. The verse aligns with the atmosphere's function as a barrier, as noted in sources like Quran and science. The term doesn't imply a solid structure, but a functional analogy, consistent with the ozone layer or magnetic field. Semen production location, Surah At-Tariq, 86, 6-7. Verse. He was created from a fluid, ejected, emerging from between the backbone and the ribs. Quran, 86, 6-7. Critics argue this inaccurately suggests semen originates between the backbone and ribs, whereas it's produced in the testes. Defense. Scholars like Maurice Bucaille and Keith L. Moore argue the verse refers to the embryonic region where the reproductive organs form, not the testes specifically. The phrase, between the backbone and ribs, describes the area where the gonads develop in early embryogenesis, aligning with modern embryology. Moore, an embryologist, incorporated Quranic descriptions into his textbook, finding them accurate. The verse uses general language to describe a complex process, not a precise anatomical claim. Broader context and considerations. Quranic perspective on science. Many sources, like Muslim Heritage and Quranica, argue the Quran encourages scientific inquiry, e.g., Surah Fussilat 41:53. We will show them our signs in the horizons and within themselves until it becomes clear to them that it is the truth. Over 700 verses reportedly touch on natural phenomena, often seen as compatible with discoveries like the Big Bang, 2130, or embryology, 23:12-14. Interpretation matters. The Quran's language is often poetic, metaphorical, or context-specific, not a scientific textbook. Critics may misinterpret verses by applying literal readings, while defenders emphasize the need for linguistic and historical context. Evolving science. What's established science can shift, e.g., Newtonian physics to relativity. Critics' claims of errors often assume current science is final, but the Quran's ambiguity allows flexibility, as noted in sources like Quran and Science. No definitive conflict. Scholars like Bucaille and Moore, cited in Learn Religions, and IslamWeb argue no Quranic verse directly contradicts unchangeable scientific facts when properly interpreted. Apparent conflicts often stem from translation issues or misreadings. Critical examination. While critics highlight these verses to challenge the Quran's divine origin, their arguments often rely on literal interpretations or outdated translations. Defenders counter that the Quran's purpose is spiritual guidance, not scientific detail, and its descriptions are broad enough to align with science when context is considered. However, skeptics might argue that these defenses involve retrofitting interpretations to fit modern knowledge, a point not fully addressed in the sources. Both sides depend on how one approaches the text, literal versus contextual. Conclusion. Quranic verses are universally accepted as definitively against science. The examples above, often cited by critics, are countered by scholars who argue they reflect poetic language, observational perspectives, or embryonic science not fully understood until recently. If you'd like a deeper dive into a specific verse, alternative translations, or how a particular scientific field, e.g., cosmology, biology, relates to the Quran, let me know. I can also generate a chart comparing interpretations if that's helpful.